Can you imagine how insanely loud those 6 machine guns would be, firing inside such a small, confined space? Not loud like a rock concert, not loud like standing next to a jet engine. Loud in a way that breaks something inside you permanently. 6 MG08 Spandau machine guns, the same water-cooled killing machines that had mowed down waves of infantry across the Western Front since 1914. All of them firing simultaneously inside a steel box 7 meters long, 3 meters wide, 3 meters high. The walls don't absorb that sound, they reflect it, amplify it, turn it into a physical force that hammers your eardrums until they bleed, rattles your teeth in their sockets, makes coherent thought impossible. Heavy machine guns of this type produce noise levels exceeding 140 decibels at the point of discharge. That number doesn't mean much until you understand what it represents. 140 decibels is the threshold where instant, permanent hearing damage becomes essentially guaranteed for unprotected ears. That's one gun. The A7V carried 6, plus a 57mm cannon, all of them firing inside an enclosed metal echo chamber where every sound wave bounced back and forth, building on itself, compounding into acoustic pressure that the human nervous system simply cannot process. If you've played Battlefield 1, you've driven this thing. The A7V, the massive German steel fortress that feels so satisfying to spawn into and lumber across the map. Millions of players who might never have picked up a history book were introduced to this machine through gaming, and they developed genuine affection for it. They recognized the name Mephisto, the red-faced demon grinning from the armor plate. They knew the tank's profile. They felt powerful behind its guns. The game brought more attention to the First World War than decades of documentaries and textbooks combined. That's genuinely valuable. But the game also did something that all entertainment does. It made the experience survivable, comfortable even. You fire 6 machine guns and hear a carefully volume-balanced audio effect designed to provide feedback without causing discomfort. You take damage and your screen shakes. You die and respawn seconds later with no lasting consequences. The real thing was designed, by accident, by committee, by the cruel mathematics of early armoured warfare, to be torture. 18 men crammed into a metal echo chamber, deafened by their own weapons within seconds of opening fire, poisoned by their own engine as carbon monoxide leaked continuously from inadequate shielding, cooked alive by heat that could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit while they wore asbestos-impregnated suits that trapped body heat against their skin. Fighting in near-total darkness, seeing combat only through narrow vision slits that reduce the battlefield to fragmentary horizontal bands of murky brown and grey. Contemporary accounts describe what happened inside. The noise was ear-piercing, and many among the crews collapsed. That wasn't metaphor. Men literally collapsed from the acoustic assault, their nervous systems overwhelmed by sound pressure waves that battered bones and ruptured eardrums. The crews who operated these machines paid a price for the privilege. In hearing, they would never recover. In respiratory damage from cordite fumes and exhaust gases. In nervous system trauma that accumulated with every engagement. The demon painted on the tank, Mephisto, the tempter from Goethe's Faust, collected his due from every man who served inside that steel coffin. And when that demon became stuck in a shell crater near Villers-Bretonneux in April 1918, when its German crew abandoned it in the churned mud of the Western Front, it wasn't British soldiers who dragged it out. The men who recovered Mephisto came from the 26th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force, Queenslanders. Men who had travelled from the other side of the world to fight in European trenches and had already survived Gallipoli, Pozières, and the grinding attrition of years of industrialized slaughter. They located that disabled tank in one of the most dangerous sectors of the Western Front. They organized its recovery under conditions that made salvage work suicidal. They worked in darkness, rigging cables by feel, communicating in whispers because sound carried across the cratered landscape to German listening posts. They dragged this demon out of its crater while enemy artillery could drop shells on them at any moment. Then they shipped it home. Not to London, not to some imperial war museum in the mother country, to Brisbane, to Queensland. That tank still sits there today, the only surviving A7V in the world, still grinning its demonic grin at anyone who comes to see what First World War armoured warfare actually looked like. The A7V Sturmpanzerwagen was designed by a committee, the Allgemeines Kriegsdepartement 7 Abteilung Verkehrswesen, which is where the designation comes from. You can tell a committee designed it because committees prioritize checking boxes over making things work as integrated systems. The box the German High Command wanted checked was simple: more firepower than the British tanks. They achieved this spectacularly. The A7V carried a 57mm Maxim Nordenfeldt cannon in the front sponson and 6 MG08 machine guns distributed around its hull. Each MG08 could sustain approximately 450 rounds per minute. The combined firepower was overwhelming on paper, a mobile fortress bristling with weapons that could suppress infantry, engage enemy armour, and dominate any sector of the battlefield it entered. The committee did not properly calculate what those weapons would do to the men operating them. The interior of the A7V was not designed for human habitation. It was designed for weapons placement. The crew compartment existed because humans were needed to operate the guns and engine, not because anyone prioritized their survival or comfort. The A7V's 18-man crew included mechanics whose job was to tend the massive Daimler engine, along with gunners for the machine guns and cannon. Each man had approximately the space of a coffin. They could not move freely. They could not escape quickly. They were wedged between ammunition boxes, engine components, and each other. The machine guns were positioned at various points around the hull, creating overlapping fields of fire that theoretically allowed the A7V to engage threats from any direction. In practice, this meant 6 muzzles pointed inward as much as outward. The acoustic energy of each weapon had nowhere to dissipate except into the enclosed space where the crew worked. Sound behaves differently in enclosed metal spaces than it does in open air. In the field, a machine gun's report dissipates rapidly, the sound waves spreading outward and losing energy with distance. Inside a steel box, those waves bounce off the walls. They reflect. They interfere with each other constructively, building amplitude instead of losing it. They create standing waves, where certain positions receive even more acoustic pressure than the source itself. The A7V crews discovered this through experience. The first time all 6 machine guns fired simultaneously during combat drills. Men who had survived years of trench warfare, men who had become accustomed to artillery bombardment, to the crack of rifle fire, to the industrial noise of modern war, found themselves facing something new, something worse. The noise wasn't just loud, it was physical. It pressed against the chest. It made vision blur as the eyeballs vibrated in their sockets. It induced immediate disorientation, nausea, and the peculiar psychological state that extreme acoustic assault produces, a feeling of unreality, of being trapped in a nightmare that the conscious mind cannot process. The crews had no hearing protection, none. No earplugs were issued, no padded headsets existed. No one in the German military bureaucracy had considered that the acoustic environment inside an armoured vehicle might require mitigation. The men's hands couldn't cover their ears because those hands were needed to operate the guns, feed ammunition belts, adjust traversing mechanisms, and perform the dozens of other tasks that combat demanded. Communication became impossible the instant weapons opened fire. Speech was useless inside the A7V. The interior was far too noisy to permit anything resembling verbal orders. The crews developed alternative systems, hand signals, shoulder grabs, kicks to the back to indicate direction changes. The only method of communication was the contact of an elbow, a touch on the shoulder, or a kick in the back. 18 men, reduced to operating through touch and gesture, deaf to each other, deaf to the world outside, locked in a shared sensory assault that bound them together even as it isolated each man in his own acoustic hell. The hearing damage was cumulative and irreversible. Each engagement stripped away more of the frequency range that the human ear can detect. Veterans of A7V service developed the distinctive partial deafness that became known colloquially as tanker's ear. These men returned from the war carrying invisible wounds that would affect them for the rest of their lives, unable to hear their children clearly, unable to enjoy music, living with a constant ringing in their ears that reminded them daily of what the A7V had taken from them. The noise was devastating. It wasn't the worst thing about serving inside an A7V. The propellant in the machine gun cartridges and cannon rounds was cordite, a smokeless powder composed of approximately 58% nitroglycerin, 37% gun cotton, and 5% mineral jelly. When cordite burns, it produces gases, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and various volatile organic compounds. In open-air environments, these gases dissipate within seconds, carried away by wind and diffusion. Inside the A7V, they accumulated. The tank's ventilation was essentially non-existent, a design oversight that treated the crew compartment as an afterthought rather than a priority. The air inside the A7V grew progressively more toxic with each burst of fire, each round from the cannon, each minute of combat. Medical research on cordite exposure had already documented that the vapor is apt to produce violent headache in those who are not accustomed to it. That research was based on workers in munitions factories, in relatively well-ventilated industrial spaces, handling cordite without firing it. The A7V crews were inhaling combustion products at concentrations no factory worker ever experienced, in an unventilated steel box, while simultaneously suffering acoustic trauma, heat stress, and the psychological pressure of combat. The cordite fumes induced headaches that built from discomfort to agony over the course of an engagement. They caused nausea and vomiting, particularly dangerous when vomiting would require removing a gas mask in contaminated air. They impaired cognitive function, making the rapid decisions that combat demanded increasingly difficult as exposure accumulated. The cordite wasn't even the primary respiratory threat. The Daimler engine that powered the A7V was a massive power plant positioned in the rear of the vehicle, separated from the crew compartment by shielding that proved utterly inadequate for its intended purpose. Carbon monoxide and other exhaust gases leaked continuously into the space where the crew worked and fought. Carbon monoxide is particularly insidious because it's invisible, odorless in low concentrations, and produces symptoms that can be mistaken for other conditions. Initial exposure causes headache and fatigue, symptoms that combat crews might attribute to stress, heat, or simple exhaustion. Continued exposure leads to confusion, impaired judgment, and loss of coordination, symptoms that could be fatal in a combat environment where rapid, accurate responses meant the difference between survival and death. Severe exposure causes unconsciousness and death. One British tanker describing conditions in similar enclosed vehicles stated, "I finished up with only the driver and myself conscious due to the escape of exhaust gas in the tank." That wasn't enemy action, that was normal operation. The machine poisoned its own crew as a matter of routine, and the A7V's massive size meant more engine, more exhaust, more poison, filling a space already choked with cordite smoke. The heat compounded every other problem. The Daimler engine generated enormous thermal energy, most of which was supposed to be expelled through exhaust and cooling systems. In practice, significant heat radiated into the crew compartment, where inadequate shielding failed to contain it. During operations in spring and summer 1918, when the A7V saw most of its combat, interior temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The crews learned to wear asbestos-impregnated suits for protection from the engine's radiant heat. These suits were effective at preventing burns from direct contact with hot surfaces. They were catastrophically counterproductive for thermoregulation. The asbestos trapped body heat against the skin, preventing the evaporative cooling that sweating provides. The suits created a microclimate of sweat and suffocation, a personal sauna that each crew member wore while simultaneously baking in the communal oven of the tank interior. Heat exhaustion was constant. The symptoms, heavy sweating, rapid pulse, muscle cramps, dizziness, nausea, overlapped with the symptoms of cordite exposure and carbon monoxide poisoning, making it nearly impossible to distinguish which hazard was causing which effect. Heat stroke was a real and present danger, capable of causing seizures, organ damage, and death. Men lost consciousness from thermal stress alone, collapsing at their stations while the battle continued around them. One Australian soldier, who later wrote of serving in tanks, described it as a strange sensation, worse than being in a submarine. Submarines, at least, had established procedures for air circulation and temperature management developed over decades of underwater operation. The A7V had 18 bodies generating metabolic heat, a roaring engine adding industrial heat, 6 machine guns and a cannon contributing the heat of rapid combustion, and no meaningful system to remove any of it. The darkness completed the sensory nightmare. The vision slits that allowed the crew to observe the outside world were narrow openings cut into armor plate, necessarily narrow because wider openings would defeat the armor's protective purpose. Each slit provided a limited horizontal band of visibility, reducing the battlefield to fragmentary glimpses that the brain struggled to assemble into coherent situational awareness. During combat, with cordite smoke thickening the air inside the tank and muzzle flashes providing strobing illumination, the interior became a nightmare of disorienting shadows. Faces of fellow crew members appeared and disappeared in the flash of gunfire. Controls were found by feel and memory rather than sight. The world outside, enemy positions, friendly troops, terrain features that might trap or liberate the vehicle, existed only in narrow bands of murky brown and grey, glimpsed between smoke clouds and the vibration that combat produced. Some First World War tanks had their interiors painted white in an effort to improve visibility for the crew, reflecting what little ambient light entered through the vision ports. The effect was minimal at best. The white paint was quickly stained by cordite residue, oil, blood, and the general filth that accumulated during operations. Whatever psychological benefit the brighter interior might have provided was lost within days of the tank entering service. The German crews developed a survival strategy that reveals everything about the conditions inside. Whenever possible, they preferred to sit atop the tank rather than inside it. Exposed to enemy fire, visible to snipers, vulnerable to artillery shrapnel and strafing aircraft. They chose this. They calculated the odds and concluded that the risk of being shot by a sniper or shredded by artillery was preferable to spending another unnecessary moment inside their own vehicle. The tank designed to protect them had become a threat in itself. The armor that was supposed to save them from enemy fire was instead trapping them with their own weapons' acoustic assault, their own engines' exhaust, their own bodies' heat. They had made a bargain with a machine, and the machine was extracting payment with every moment of operation. The tank received a name that proved grimly prophetic: Mephisto. The red, grinning demon from Goethe's Faust was painted on the upper front left armor plate, smiling his knowing smile at anyone who approached. In the Faust legend, Mephistopheles is the tempter who offers the scholar everything he desires: knowledge, power, youth, pleasure, in exchange for his immortal soul. The bargain seems favorable at first. Faust gets everything he asked for. The price comes due later, when it is too late to reconsider, when the pleasures have been exhausted and only the debt remains. The German crew who chose this name understood something about their vehicle. Maybe they understood it consciously, choosing the name as dark humor, the kind of gallows wit that soldiers develop when they cannot speak plainly about the horrors they face. Maybe they understood it unconsciously, their choice reflecting a truth they sensed but couldn't articulate. Either way, the name was accurate. Mephisto offered its crew firepower, the ability to devastate enemy infantry, to engage hostile armor, to dominate the battlefield with concentrated killing power. It collected its payment in hearing, in respiratory health, in nervous system damage that accumulated with every engagement. Other A7Vs bore names drawn from the same cultural well of Germanic mythology and legend. Siegfried carried the name of the dragon slayer who bathed in dragon's blood to become invulnerable, a hope that the armor would hold, that the tank would protect its crew from enemy weapons the way the dragon's blood protected the hero. Wotan invoked the father of the gods, a figure of wisdom and war and ultimate power, a prayer for divine protection, for the favor of powers beyond human understanding. Gretchen was perhaps the most poignant name among the A7Vs, perhaps named for a sweetheart back home, or perhaps for the innocent young woman in the Faust legend itself, the one who suffers most from Faust's bargain with the devil. Naming a tank after her might have been an expression of longing for the sweethearts left behind at home. It might have been a grimmer acknowledgement of the innocent victims that all weapons create. Only 20 A7Vs were ever produced during the entire war. 20. Total. The German armoured force was essentially a rounding error compared to British and French production. While the Entente powers churned out thousands of tanks with industrial efficiency, Germany struggled with raw material shortages, production bottlenecks, and the effects of the Allied blockade that was slowly strangling the German economy. The A7V was rare not because it was special, but because Germany couldn't build more of them. The steel required for armor plating was needed for artillery shells and naval vessels. The skilled workers required for assembly were needed in munitions factories and at the front. The engines, the tracks, the machine guns, the optical equipment, every component competed for resources that Germany couldn't spare. When Battlefield 1 players battle dozens of German A7V tanks, they're experiencing a dramatic inflation of historical reality. The game needed a German heavy tank to match British and French options for gameplay balance, and the A7V was the only candidate available. So the game multiplied its numbers far beyond anything the German army achieved. In the actual war, seeing even one A7V was remarkable. Seeing several in a single engagement was the exception, not the rule. The Rarity made each A7V precious to the German army, and made capturing one an intelligence coup for the Allies. These were vehicles whose design details, mechanical specifications, and operational limitations were largely unknown to British and French commanders. An intact A7V could be studied, its vulnerabilities identified, its crew arrangements documented for future tactical planning. Most A7Vs that were knocked out in combat were too damaged for meaningful analysis. When artillery hit them, when enemy tanks penetrated their armour, when they caught fire and burned, the resulting wrecks were useful for confirming that the vehicle had been destroyed, but offered limited insight into how it worked when intact. An abandoned A7V, one that could be recovered and examined without the damage of combat, was invaluable. Mephisto became that tank. Stuck in a shell crater near Villers-Bretonneux, its tracks spinning uselessly in mud that had swallowed countless men and horses and machines, abandoned by its German crew when recovery became impossible, the demon with the grinning face waited for someone to find it. Villers-Bretonneux was a small French town that became one of the most critical defensive positions on the Western Front in April 1918. The German offensive of April 1918 punched through Allied lines with an intensity that stunned defenders, who had become accustomed to static trench warfare. German stormtroopers, trained in new infiltration tactics that bypassed strongpoints and exploited weaknesses, advanced further in days than any offensive had achieved in years. The British Fifth Army collapsed. The French scrambled to plug gaps. For the first time since 1914, the war of movement had returned to the Western Front. Amiens was the objective that mattered most. The railway junction there was essential for Allied logistics, the hub through which reinforcements, ammunition, food and supplies moved from the ports to the front. If Amiens fell, British and French armies would be split apart, their communications severed, their ability to coordinate defence compromised. The German High Command knew this. They directed their offensive toward the city with everything they could muster. Villers-Bretonneux stood in the way. The Australians who held this sector weren't fresh troops. The Australian Imperial Force had been fighting first at Gallipoli, then on the Western Front through Pozières, Bullecourt, Messines and Passchendaele. They had watched the British Fifth Army shatter under the German assault. They had seen what happened when defensive lines broke. They were determined that their sector would hold. The German attack on Villers-Bretonneux in April 1918 saw A7V Sturmpanzerwagen advance against the town, supported by infantry and protected by morning fog that concealed their approach. British tanks moved to intercept. The engagement that followed was confused, chaotic, fought in fog and smoke. What mattered most to the men fighting for Villers-Bretonneux was that the Germans took the town. By the end of the assault, German forces controlled Villers-Bretonneux. They had broken through the defensive line. If they could consolidate their gains, if they could bring up reinforcements and prepare defensive positions of their own, the entire Allied position in the sector might collapse. The Australians counterattacked. The fighting was close quarters, building to building, street to street. Bayonets and rifle butts, and the point-blank exchange of fire between men who could see each other's faces in the flash of weapons. They paid heavily for retaking the town. In the aftermath of this fighting, as the front stabilised and both sides dug into new positions, Australian patrols began exploring the terrain around Villers-Bretonneux. They were mapping the new front line, identifying German positions, locating threats that would have to be neutralised or avoided. Somewhere in that churned landscape of shell craters and wire and bodies, they found Mephisto. The tank sat tilted in a crater where it had become hopelessly stuck. Its tracks had lost purchase in the mud, the same mud that had swallowed so many men and horses, the same bottomless muck that defined the Western Front. The vehicle weighed approximately 30 tons. Its track system was inadequate for this terrain, designed with short, narrow tracks that provided insufficient ground pressure and terrible traction in the conditions that prevailed across no man's land. The German crew had abandoned it. When recovery became impossible to extract under fire, when the vehicle became a liability rather than an asset, they climbed out and retreated. They left behind one of only 20 A7Vs in existence, a vehicle whose intelligence value alone made it worth the risk of recovery. The Australians who found Mephisto recognized what they had discovered. They reported it up the chain of command, and someone, a commander with vision enough to see the opportunity, with authority enough to allocate resources to exploiting it, authorized a recovery operation. The men who undertook this operation came primarily from Queensland units, specifically the 26th Battalion AIF. They weren't engineers, they weren't tank specialists or mechanical experts. They were infantry soldiers who had been fighting in trenches and craters for months, burying friends, killing enemies, surviving through luck and skill and the grim determination that defined the Australian Imperial Force. The recovery would have to happen at night. Mephisto sat in territory that was nominally Allied-controlled, but was within observation range of German positions. Any daylight activity around the tank would be spotted. Artillery would be called. The salvage party would be destroyed. Darkness brought its own problems. The men couldn't see what they were doing. They worked by feel, locating the massive steel hull through touch, rigging cables around attachment points they discovered through trial and error. They communicated in whispers because sound carried across the cratered landscape, and German listening posts were always alert for movement. A single loud noise, a dropped tool, a shouted instruction could bring flares arcing into the sky, illuminating the salvage party against the broken ground, making them targets for machine guns. The work was physical, exhausting, dangerous. They dug around the tracks where they had sunk into the mud, trying to free the vehicle for movement. They rigged cables and chains that could be attached to draft animals or trucks. They worked in darkness, in mud that sucked at their boots, in the constant awareness that German artillery could drop shells on their position at any moment. The operation was conducted at night, under the constant threat of German observation and potential counterattack, with men working in darkness to rig towing cables and coordinate the effort. Throughout this process, the Germans knew the tank was there. They knew Australians were trying to recover it. German artillery harassed the area, dropping shells on suspected positions, trying to destroy both the salvage party and the tank they were salvaging. The Australians persisted. British tanks provided the towing power. The Australians did not have tank assets of their own to bring to the operation, and British crews assisted with the mechanical aspects of the recovery. The official records document that the tanks and a detachment from the 26th Battalion successfully recovered Mephisto and towed it to safety. They dragged the demon out of its crater and back to lines where it could be examined, documented, and eventually shipped to Australia. The bureaucratic record of what happened next reveals how colonial achievements were absorbed into imperial narratives. When Mephisto was reported as captured, when the paperwork began its journey through channels, the specificity of Australian involvement started to blur. Reports mentioned British forces, technically accurate from one perspective, since Australia was part of the British Empire, but historically wrong in every way that mattered. British officers filed British reports. British systems tracked British war prizes. The administrative machinery that processed captured equipment was centred in London, staffed by personnel whose default assumption was that anything done by imperial forces was done by British forces. This happened constantly during the war. Australian valour at Gallipoli was frequently reported as British achievement. Australian casualties at the Somme were counted in imperial totals that obscured their specific origin. The living returned home to a nation still constitutionally subordinate to London, still struggling to articulate an independent identity, and found that their achievements had been credited to a country most of them had never seen. The documentary evidence of Mephisto's capture by Australians is overwhelming and unambiguous. I think the attached reports make it clear that the tank was captured by the 26th Battalion, as one official document stated, in response to later questions about attribution. Unit diaries from the 26th Battalion record the recovery operation. Australian soldiers are identified by name in contemporary accounts. The tank's subsequent journey to Brisbane, not to London, confirms whose trophy it was. The tank arrived in Queensland after the war, allocated through the War Trophy distribution system to the state whose soldiers had captured it. It was displayed publicly, became a landmark, drew visitors from across the state who came to see this strange, angular machine that their fathers and brothers and cousins had dragged from the mud of France. For generations, Queensland children visited the museum and stared up at Mephisto. They saw the red demon grinning from the armour plate. They heard stories from family members who had served, who had faced German armour, who remembered things they mostly didn't discuss. The tank became Queensland's tangible connection to the war, physical proof that something specific had happened on the other side of the world, and that Queenslanders had done it. The Queensland Museum, where Mephisto now resides, has worked to preserve both the vehicle and its history accurately. Conservation efforts have stabilised the tank for future generations. Educational materials explicitly acknowledge the Australian soldiers who captured it. The signage, the interpretation, the official documentation, all of it credits the men of the 26th Battalion who risked their lives to recover this demon from no man's land. The 3D scanning projects now underway at the Queensland Museum are ensuring that this sole surviving A7V will be preserved digitally for visitors who haven't been born yet. The Queensland Museum recognised that Mephisto wasn't just a piece of military equipment. It was an artifact of immense historical significance, the only physical evidence of what Germany's response to Allied armour actually looked like. And it was Queensland's possession, Queensland's responsibility, Queensland's story to tell. The museum's efforts extended beyond physical preservation. Research into the tank's history documented what had been known informally: that Australian soldiers captured it, that the British attribution was incorrect, that the administrative confusion of wartime record-keeping had obscured a specifically Australian achievement. This research provided the documentary foundation for correcting decades of casual misattribution. Standing in front of Mephisto in Brisbane, you're looking at something that was never meant to survive. 19 of its sister vehicles were destroyed or scrapped. The attrition of war and the passage of time eliminated every other A7V that Germany produced. Only this one endured, because it got stuck in the right crater at the right time, because Australian soldiers found it before it could be destroyed, because they successfully recovered it under conditions that would have defeated most salvage operations, because the bureaucratic systems of war trophy distribution allocated it to Queensland. The contingency of history is written into this tank's survival. Change any variable and the A7V exists only in photographs and schematics. The tracks don't get stuck in that particular crater. The crew doesn't abandon it. The Australians don't find it or find it too damaged to recover, or get killed trying to recover it. The War Trophy system sends it to London instead of Brisbane. The museum lets it deteriorate. Any of those alternatives was possible. None of them happened. The demon that collected its due from German crews now serves different purposes. It educates visitors about early armoured warfare. It commemorates Australian achievement in the First World War. It connects the present to a past that would otherwise exist only in words and photographs. You can read about the A7V's dimensions in a book: 7 meters long, 3 meters wide, 3 meters high. You can see period photographs of A7Vs in combat. But standing in front of the actual machine creates understanding that text cannot achieve. The narrow vision slits become comprehensible when you see how small they are relative to the massive hull. The cramped interior becomes imaginable when you understand the scale of the vehicle and try to picture 18 men inside it. The acoustic nightmare becomes more real when you see the enclosed steel box and understand that 6 machine guns fired within it. The museum doesn't recreate the noise, or the fumes, or the heat. It couldn't. The experience would be intolerable. But the physical presence of the tank makes those conditions imaginable in ways that description alone does not. For Australians specifically, Mephisto represents something beyond historical curiosity. It represents agency. Australian forces in World War I participated in an imperial system that frequently denied them credit for their achievements. They fought under British command, used British equipment, were administered through British bureaucracy. Their victories were often recorded as British victories. Their sacrifices were anonymised into imperial statistics. Mephisto sits in Brisbane, not London, not the Imperial War Museum. Brisbane. This matters because it's physical proof that Australian soldiers did specific things, not as anonymous extensions of British imperial power, but as men from Queensland who took risks and accomplished something that required identification and acknowledgement. Every time a visitor stands in front of this tank, they're seeing evidence of Australian achievement that cannot be attributed to anyone else. The tank is in Brisbane because Australians brought it there. The story of its capture is part of Queensland's history because Queenslanders captured it. The frustration among Australians who care about attribution isn't pedantry. It's the insistence that historical accuracy matters, that achievements deserve proper credit, that the bureaucratic confusion of wartime record-keeping shouldn't permanently obscure who did what. When British publications or international histories claim that British forces captured Mephisto, Australians correct them, not out of narrow nationalism, but out of respect for the men who actually did the work. The Anzac legend, whatever mythological accretions have attached to it over the decades, rests on genuine achievement and genuine sacrifice. The men who captured Mephisto were veterans of that tradition, soldiers who had developed the grim professionalism that characterized Australian forces by 1918. They didn't capture the tank for glory. They captured it because it was there, because it was valuable, because taking it from the Germans felt like a small victory in a war that offered few clear victories. The historical significance got assigned afterward, by people who weren't there. The Australians who rigged cables in darkness, who worked in whispers, who dragged something heavy across dangerous ground, they were doing a job. The fact that Mephisto would become the sole surviving A7V, that it would sit in a museum for over a century, that millions of gamers would encounter its name in a video game released nearly 100 years after its capture, none of that was predictable. History is contingent. The demon survived because of a specific sequence of events that could easily have gone differently. It sits in Brisbane because specific decisions were made by specific people, from the soldiers who captured it, to the administrators who allocated it, to the curators who preserved it. Each decision could have been different. None were. The sensory nightmare inside that machine is over now. No one will ever again experience the acoustic torture of 6 machine guns firing simultaneously in an enclosed steel box. No one will breathe the cordite smoke and carbon monoxide that poisoned German crews. No one will feel the heat of the Daimler engine baking them in asbestos suits while they try to operate controls by touch in near-total darkness. Mephisto is silent. The demon that once roared with engine noise and gunfire and the screams of men who couldn't hear each other now sits quietly in a museum, grinning at visitors who will never know what it was like to serve inside, except through imagination and the fragmentary accounts that survived. The silence is part of the story. Standing in front of Mephisto, you're standing in front of something that was never meant to be silent. It was designed to roar. The silence is an absence, a negative space where all that noise used to be. The clean air of the museum is an absence where cordite smoke and engine exhaust once filled men's lungs. The comfortable temperature is an absence where 120-degree heat once cooked men inside their own protective clothing. The Australians who captured this demon didn't just capture German equipment. They captured evidence of what early armoured warfare actually looked like. Not the sanitized version, not the game version, but the reality of men trapped inside a machine that tortured them even when the enemy failed to. They preserved that evidence for future generations who would otherwise have only words to imagine it with. Battlefield 1 introduced millions of players to this tank. The game made the A7V famous again, gave it cultural prominence it hadn't enjoyed since the war itself, created a generation of players who recognized the name Mephisto and the distinctive angular profile. That's genuinely valuable. The game sparked curiosity about a conflict that had faded from popular consciousness. The game couldn't show the reality. No game can. The real experience of serving inside an A7V was not something that entertainment can or should faithfully recreate. You spawn in the game's A7V and feel powerful. The real crews paid for their power in permanent hearing loss. You take damage in the game and your screen shakes. The real crews breathed poison that accumulated in their lungs with every minute of operation. You die in the game and respawn. The real crews didn't get second chances. The gap between entertainment and reality isn't a criticism of the game. It's a recognition of what entertainment is and what it can do. Battlefield 1 made people curious about World War I. The curiosity leads somewhere. To documentaries, to books, to museum visits, where people stand in front of actual artifacts and try to understand what their great-grandparents' generation experienced. Mephisto is where that curiosity can lead. The demon with the grinning face, the sole survivor of a class of vehicles designed by committee and operated in conditions that no modern safety standard would permit. It sits in Brisbane because Australian soldiers dragged it from a shell crater, because Queensland claimed it as their war prize, because generations of museum staff have preserved it for visitors who keep coming. The men who served inside A7Vs during the war, German crews who named their vehicles after demons and gods and sweethearts, are all dead now. The last veterans of World War I died decades ago. The memories of what it was actually like inside these machines exist only in written accounts and the physical evidence of the vehicles themselves. Mephisto is the only one left. It carries the weight of representing every A7V that was built, every crew that served, every man who paid the demon's price in health and hearing and nervous system damage. The tank's survival means something different now than it would have meant in 1920 or 1950 or even 2000. Before Battlefield 1, the A7V was an obscure historical footnote, known to military historians and tank enthusiasts, but invisible to popular culture. After the game, millions of people recognized it. The Mephisto name that German crews painted on the armor plate became a brand, a reference point, a cultural touchstone. That cultural prominence brings responsibility. The people who manage Mephisto's legacy, the Queensland Museum, the historians who research its history, the writers who tell its story, are custodians of something that matters to more people than ever before. They owe accuracy to the German crews who suffered inside it, and to the Australian crews who captured it, and to everyone who comes to understand the war through this one surviving vehicle. The accuracy includes attributing the capture correctly. It includes describing the conditions honestly. It includes refusing to sanitize the horror for the sake of entertainment, or to obscure the credit for the sake of bureaucratic convenience. Next time you think about the A7V, whether through a video game or a documentary or a visit to Brisbane, remember what it was actually like inside. Remember the noise that destroyed hearing in seconds. Remember the fumes that poisoned lungs with every breath. Remember the heat and darkness and cramped terror of fighting blind inside a steel coffin. Remember that the crews who operated these vehicles paid a price that no respawn could reset. Remember who captured the last surviving example. Australians. Men from Queensland who travelled to the other side of the world, fought through years of industrial slaughter, watched their mates die at Villers-Bretonneux, and dragged a demon out of the mud to bring it home. That demon sits in Brisbane now, grinning at everyone who comes to see it. It can't hurt anyone anymore. The Australians made sure of that. Subscribe for more stories like this.